Okay, so I'm going to talk about Linux. Don't leave. I realize Linux may not be a high priority for a lot of people, especially if you're on the retail side of the font business. I would say that you should care at least a little bit about that, though. There's some interesting user groups there, academics and scientists. There's also a lot of Chromebooks out in the world, and set-top boxes. For me, though, I care about Linux because I use Linux, and I have for a good 15 years. And it always kind of troubled me that there's this big gap, like the best, allegedly best typesetting software ever, tech, is open source and free software. But the average experience freezing fonts on Linux is pretty weak. It's not even a good font manager. But that has actually changed a lot in the past year or two, and I'm going to talk about why. So first, a little background. I promise this is the only slide of software architecture that you're going to see. But just so you understand, there's a bunch of distributors of Linux, and they all make different choices. Some of them you might have heard of, Red Hat or Ubuntu, some of them you haven't. But what goes into each distribution is by choice, but for the most part, when we talk about desktop Linux, we're talking about the GNOME stack. It's a big, terrible, nested acronym I recommend you forget immediately. But that sort of encompasses as an umbrella all the different frameworks you would use to write an application. At the top of that is something called GTK, and GTK is the toolkit that gives you like standard windows and buttons and menus and things like that. That's roughly equivalent to AppKit on a Mac. Down in the text layer, though, you have a bunch of different libraries. So Pango is what does basic layout like line breaking and directionality. A font config just maps like a font name to an actual file in the system and lets you set things like anti-aliasing. Harfbuzz does OpenType shaping, and FreeType is what actually renders Beziers into pixels. And on Apple, those are all one library, core text. So the interesting thing is that these separate libraries on the Linux side get used in other places, like in web browsers. So when the browser people, or Adobe, have contributed code for, say, variable font support to these lower level libraries, the Linux distributions get that work done for free, basically. And that is what actually happened with variable fonts, which we are required to discuss by EU law. The plumbing layer support landed end of 2016, beginning of 2017. The trickle-up economics take a little longer to work, so the higher levels didn't get their support until later. 2018 was Pango. And that culminated at the top of the stack with the GTK release 3.24 from Thursday. And yes, I mean like 6 days ago. So the screenshots you see are actually from pre-release versions. But normal people care about applications, not about libraries. So what really works? The browsers work. That's pretty obvious. If the browser exists on Linux, it does. Sort of the lone holdout there is WebKit. WebKit is the engine that's used by Safari. There's a Linux version of that. It's sort of an embedded HTML viewer for different things. They haven't hooked up support for variable fonts yet, but I talked to the developers, and it's just a matter of someone sitting down to do it, so I expect it to happen pretty soon. At the application level, currently the only thing implementing variable fonts is Inkscape, which is an SVG vector editor. And you have to get the development versions of that, but that's been around since March. The other two big candidates there would be Scribus, which is a desktop publishing application, and LibreOffice, which is a general purpose office suite. Those are both like staunchly cross-platform, so I think it's going to take them longer to do things in a generic way that works on every platform. But in Inkscape, in those edge builds, this is what you see currently when you select a variable font. You get all those named instances as if they were styles, and you get the CSS that corresponds to it. And then you get sliders down at the bottom, because variable fonts are slider fonts. And there's some bugs there. I think that you don't see a label on the contrast axis like you'd want to, but it's there. Probably more interesting, though, is the GTK support, because that's across the entire platform, which means any application can use it. At the moment, the font config layer gives static and named instances as static fonts, so any application that doesn't know what's going on will just see those. The printing side should work. I just don't know if anyone has actually tried that yet. And for users, what you're going to see is the font selection widget. And this is what it looks like if you just ask for the old version. You'll see those named instances as if they were real fonts on the system, but if you request in the code the fancy version, you get that little gear icon that gives you details, and you can access the sliders that way. And you'll see also that you have some information about OpenType features. which is the next topic. This has been going on a bit longer, so there's more to say. Travel back to ATypI 2014 in your mind, that pivotal moment in history when everyone demanded work be done on OpenType feature UIs. I was there for that, so about 6 months later, there was this conference of open source graphics developers, and I slipped an OpenType feature session into the program, and about 35 people showed up, and they seemed interested, and today, all three of those main applications have some form of OpenType feature interface that you can use. That includes the stable version of Inkscape and LibreOffice, as well as the development ones. And so it's been improving for quite a while. It includes GTK as of last Thursday. So in the stable version of Inkscape, this is what you see. It's a predefined list of features they're showing. I think you'll notice that some of those choices may be odd, like for the capitals section. By using radio buttons, those things are mutually exclusive, which isn't necessarily how you would use it. You can input other feature settings in that box at the bottom. Also note that there's not a preview of what you see. That has to be done to a selection on the canvas, so you see the preview in your document. And then you can access all of the alternate glyphs in a separate panel. This is what you see in Scribus. The feature detection is done on the fly here, so it looks different for different fonts, so you see two side by side. Some other quirks you'll notice in the UI, apparently they didn't expect that people might skip numbers in their stylistic sets, which is a teachable moment for possibly both sides. And here again, you don't see a preview in this feature palette, you see it only on the document. This is from LibreOffice 6.2, and in version 6.1, you could enter CSS style feature code in the font selection or in the font menu. But that's really hard to discover, so a big improvement in 6.2, which is sort of the pre-release version, is that you have a dialog box where you can select things. And what they're showing at the bottom is the name of the font, and if the feature happens to apply to the name of the font, you'll see it changed on there, and you also see the corresponding CSS style code, which is pretty handy, particularly because LibreOffice also supports graphite features, and you might not be as familiar with the syntax there. But as it turns out, this question of what you do to preview the feature is not as simple as you might think. This is from the Edge build of Inkscape. You still have that sort of predefined list of common features at the top, but they show you everything else too. And it gets a little hard to make sense out of after a while, right? Like, the numbers are predefined. We know what those are going to be. If you can't figure out what to demonstrate for /0, I mean, you're not going to get much further with the rest of the features. But it's basically just reading the contents of the feature lookup and then showing it to you. And as you can see, that numerical alternates feature gets a little awkward. The worst case I found was this, which is Fura code. And I stretched that window out all the way so you couldn't see the canvas. That's not what you normally see. But the point is, when you have just a long string of arbitrary letters, it's not really helpful anymore. You really kind of want to see actual text in a word. This is the GTK version. They're trying to be smarter and limit what they show you, but to make some choices about those sample strings. And as a tangent, I got a lot of questions when this work was going on about what different features do. As it turns out, the documentation on the official registry has some shortcomings. It's real specific about things, but it's written for a type designer, not for a software implementer, which is fair, I guess, because there's thousands of times more fonts than there are operating systems. But in particular, it tells you what the function of a feature is, but not how it's actually used. So what is case-sensitive forms? It doesn't say. And if the solution is, well, you just need to know to go to typedrawers.com and set up an account and ask your question there, that's kind of not good enough in the long run. So I think we could improve that a bit. But like I said, the mutual exclusivity and which things are for a character, which things for a whole document, that could probably stand to be expanded a bit. Anyway, back to the pictures. GTK wants these preview strings to be useful, not just technically accurate. You don't have a lot of options. You could either try and parse the whole lookup or take an educated guess at a relevant word, but if you don't do that, then you have to use some sort of sample. And in the other cases we saw, like the document editors, they could just use the current text selection. But that doesn't work for GTK because it might not be a dialog box from a document. It might be like a system preference you're setting where there is no document and there is no text selection. So they need something else. And they floated a few ideas. The first one was, well, maybe you just save that in a separate file somewhere. Obviously, that's a problem because these files don't exist. For any current font, either does a real predefined format, plus they'd get lost. You embed a font in a document, you don't get that sidecar with it. The next idea was maybe use the meta table, like we do for the design language now. As it turns out, you shouldn't use the meta table for strings. You're supposed to hook meta table entries to the name table. And at that point, you might as well just amend the spec. So the current thinking is we'd like to see some changes and maybe have some sample strings available for other features. As it stands, there's two places in OpenType where you do get a sample string. There's name ID 19, which is for the whole font. And you can put whatever you want there. You can choose something that's specific to the audience. You can try and monetize it. You can express your personal philosophy. And then there's the character variant feature, which is designed to be practical. So character variants, you get a sample string. So if it's the African form of eng, you maybe want to show that in a word and not just by itself. And this is essentially what GTK would like to see added to other features. There's some potential uses for that. Maybe your case-sensitive forms have diacritics and just showing the punctuation doesn't give you a good enough sample. Maybe for contextual lookups, it's just not possible to parse that in the amount of time that you have. Possibly because you can do internationalized things, you could show different strings to different locales. Anyway, expect to see a proposal for adding this if you want to talk about it. I'll probably end up writing it, so come see me. If you want to talk me out of it, come see me as well. So there are a few things that didn't make it into this past GTK release that are worth looking at. The first of those is embedded font metadata. This is actually tracked already in font config and other places, and you can see that in the font installer, which reads all of this stuff. It's just a matter of making that available locally in a database. And I think the idea here is to make it a system service, so it's reusable, so Inkscape doesn't have to also do all that parsing work. It also, I think, opens up some possible applications in other areas, like if there's a missing font in a document that someone sends you, maybe the program can be a little smarter about helping you find an alternative if it has access to this metadata, and not just making you choose from a menu. And then the last thing is, when variable fonts get rolled out, you want to have some sort of like you do with a color palette, your recently used colors, to save variable font instances that you've used in the past, so you don't have to just eyeball those sliders every single time. Then there's a couple of things that are a little bit further out, but that do more system integration work. For one thing, a font package can include a lot of other stuff other than just the binaries. And so GTK would like to weaponize that somehow because it gets stuffed in and never looked at after the fact. For a distro-provided font, it actually always ends up in the same place in this directory user/share/doc, and it's forgotten about forever. The concept is really just to give you an indicator that something exists, and then you can see what's available for the font and open that in whatever the relevant viewer is for that file type. That's easy to do for the distro fonts that come through the package manager. I think the holdup is you want that to work for something that the user installs himself that they've like downloaded. And so there's a little more UI, UX flow work to be done there with the font installer being smarter about it. Even further out, there are some other special locations in the file system where if you put a document, it becomes hooked into the help system. So this is like Spotlight, where you can search for something and find relevant work. And that already works for system-wide and per-user directories. And when I say it works, this works already. I've been doing this for a couple of months with font packages on my own computer. So I can search for things that I know are in the font documentation, and it turns up. This is from E.B. Garamond. When you talk about hooking into the help system, there's kind of a gray area between help and documentation and those sample strings I was talking about. But I would say that the sample strings show you what a feature does, for example, but the documentation and the help system tells you why it exists. Like, oh, this is for not using ligatures at syllable boundaries or whatever. That's helpful while you're working. And there's other fonts that you just need help to understand. This is Bungee, and you're not going to guess your way to all of Bungee's complex features. You need to read the docs. And it's just more helpful, I think, if you don't have to leave the application you're working in and go to the website and try to read it somewhere else and then come back. It's pretty simple to do this. It's just HTML with no JavaScript and not using like static links. I mean, not using, what's the word for that? Well, just be smart about your links. If you think this is not interesting because it's on Linux, it actually works on the Mac too. There's a little more work involved to register something with the help system, and that only an application can do it. So you would probably have to ask Apple to make the font installer do this for you, but it's possible. When will it see the light of day? I don't know. I went to a Debian conference in July and talked to font packagers. Debian produces the vast majority of the font packages on Linux systems. It's a chicken and egg thing. Everyone seems to like the idea. No one wants to be the first person to do it with their package. But I think it's worth looking at because it's a way, when you integrate with the system utilities, you bridge that gap between being a content object that the user manipulates and being a software package, right? Linux, you're stuck on one side or the other typically, and you really want fonts to be useful in both ways. And again, it's sort of a matter with a lot of these features of not making someone leave their workflow and go somewhere else to get their questions answered, but to keep them where they are. And in a way, this and the GTK font chooser work, it's just about pushing more intelligence into the platform. So maybe it's okay if there's not a good font manager for Linux. If every application has access to this metadata and stuff, why should we require someone to go download and learn a separate application just to work with their fonts? I don't know. So that's it for now. I'd love to tell you a year from now that things are perfect. At the very least, maybe they'll be better. And as long as we can keep saying that, I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you for listening. I'm going to leave you with a few links if you want to follow specific features as they get worked on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to mention a couple of our sponsors. We have some very